Unlike the earlier versions of the agenda that we had on paper, I wanted to rather introduce the lab that we have at the KDI school, especially the one that very closely relates to the issue of governance. So today, my goal is to maybe sort of provide you with an overview of the kind of research plans that we have at our school, as well as a brief overview about the lab system, in particular, the Experiment Lab for Public Management Research, EXPMR, that I'm a member of. And then I'll try to go through a couple of projects or project research design and ideas that we currently are developing with the goal of hopefully fielding in the field pretty soon. So that's kind of the agenda for today, and let me get started. So here's the outline. Yes, I needed to work on both. All right. So here's an outline for the presentation. As I said, overview of the lab and its projects. Then we are also engaging in and actually finishing up a draft on a systematic review of experimental research on public service motivation, or also known as PSM. So I'd like to also briefly introduce that to you as kind of a background as to where we're coming from. And then the third item, the research design for the multi-phased experimental study of the impact of civil service exam on selecting public servants. This is sort of where we're headed next. So we have a research design, and we have all the kind of the background infrastructure ready to field this project. And I thought it'd be a nice opportunity for me to present this to you, and also hopefully solicit some feedback to maybe better improve the design. And then, if time permits, I would also like to talk a little bit about some of our other projects in planning. So, with the overview. So the KDI school launched a new lab system at the start of 2020 with the goal of publishing high quality research outputs, doing rigorously performed large-scale projects, as well as sort of promoting a collaborative research environment. And this event today being a very relevant key effort related to the efforts of our labs. In fact, you'll see in the overall agenda that our school labs, 4 different labs, are all involved in these different sessions. So we're trying to build a structure where we can do really good research and also to work with others and maybe do even better research. And in that context, the particular lab projects I wanted to introduce today is from our EXPMR lab, which aims to perform and promote experiments, especially in public management research. Just to sort of put some faces to the names, I put up some photos up there of our core members, as well as some of our other academic members in our team, as well as some of our research affiliates who are working with us for collaborative projects. And we hope to further expand our networks as we explore different opportunities for collaboration for more research, both in the academia as well as the policy world. So some of the research projects and activities that we have ongoing thus far include the systematic review that I will be talking about in a moment, the multi-phased experimental study, which I will also be talking about in a moment, as well as developing a measurement strategy for spatially and temporally comparable measure of PSM, and social experimental evaluation of social impact bonds in South Korea. But today, my focus will be mostly on these top 2 lines. So first, with the review on the experimental research on PSM. So a lot of you who are familiar with the literature in public management, especially in governance and bureaucracy, civil service, will be quite familiar with the terms of public service motivation. This is the idea that people who are more likely to serve in public sector have this sort of distinct motivation to be a public servant. And based on the early kind of canonical work by Perry and Weiss in 1990, there's been a lot of research on this issue, looking at the impact of PSM, so what kind of outputs can PSM affect, as well as maybe better capturing and measuring PSM, and also looking at what are kind of the determinants, what are the things that influence PSM. So how do you get people who are more sort of public-minded and civil service motivated through what kind of interventions, or what are the kind of characteristics that are related to higher or lower PSM. But most of these studies were limited to observational approaches, and this being a conference on impact evaluation, I wanted to highlight a few limitations that we can consider from the research that has been done so far. The first, there are a lot of confounds that's very difficult to manage in a purely observational setting unless you have a very tight and nicely designed sort of research design. So as an example, individuals with high PSM may be more likely to be patient and persevere during difficult times, but this may be related to not just PSM, but with other factors as well, maybe something like gender or religion, as we actually see in the literature. And without the ability to rule out these other causal channels that can affect both the PSM and some other outcome of interest or core independent variable, it'd be really hard to look at the actual relationship of the different variables with the PSM. Also, there can be measurement errors. So we've seen already that cross-national or culturally different settings show very much of an instability in different components of the PSM measure, as well as sort of the inherent limitation of the measure itself. Essentially, we are asking people whether you have this very nice quality to be a very good civil servant, right? So that in and of itself will lead to a considerable degree of social desirability bias, because PSM itself is a socially desirable value, and you always have this incentive to look nice to others. So capturing this quality in survey settings and observational settings, which have been the most prevalent form of research so far, has these type of certain limitations. Now, with that, we wanted to look at then, okay, what are some of the experimental studies out there that we can try to turn to and try to learn from how we can better establish sort of understanding the causal effects on and causal effects of PSM. And we've done a sort of what we believe to be a very systematic and thorough search of the literature. So without going into too much detail, from the SSCI index journals, we looked for journal articles that have both the PSM and experiment included in its main text, title, or the abstract. And we manually inspected the ones that kind of got under our net to look at whether, more closely investigate whether the main methodological approach claimed by the authors were experimental, as well as whether the PSM was either the core independent or the dependent variable in the study. And we narrowed these studies down for our review. So once we've done that, this is kind of like a very simple, and I'm going to show you a few very simple descriptive graphs. So we see that, you know, there's not much, but still overall kind of growing production of experimental research into PSM over time. And that still, though, this is very geographically concentrated in a few countries. So you see the US up there, and then followed by a few countries in Europe, Denmark, Germany, and Netherlands. But you can also find, oh, I want to go back. Oh, I had my Korea all highlighted there, but this is probably an earlier version. So you can also see Korea on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th line. So it seems like this is also one of those topic areas where the Korean scholars have been pretty active compared to many other fields. In our paper, we also think about trying to understand what are the main topics that these experimental studies on PSM are interested in. So some of these may look very familiar to you. The big red area shows something about PSM, satisfaction, different sectors, leadership, motivation, whereas the purple box on the right is very closely related to intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, these types of things. So even with a small sample of these studies, we can try to see kind of there's a good cluster of works based on different types of topics. And this is basically the same information presented in a different manner. And that can be also organized into a citation network. So the same sort of topic information now, we are overlaying that on top of the network of citations of the different works. And I also had this red box come up in the middle so that I can highlight Perry 1990 in the middle where it all got started. But then starting from there, we see all these different communities of work that are sometimes pretty distinct and other times linked by a few authors. And in our manuscript, we want to also further engage in which are the kind of the works that bridges the different communities of the work on experimental research on PSM. But having said that, it seems like despite the greater interest and probably the importance of conducting more rigorous and causally identified, hopefully, research, the overall average number of citations for these type of work does not seem to be that optimistic, at least. Of course, like the really recent ones, since it's not been that much of a time since they were published, so over time probably they will catch up, but it seems like after the early hits of some of the new experimental work, there has not been too much of a traction looking into the usage of experimental work in studying PSM. And kind of last thing I wanted to highlight from this kind of review of the work is that even though different countries are publishing more or less on this topic, the collaboration networks seem to be also geographically confined to, as you can see on the upper right corner. And Korea on the sort of, as you saw, rank 5 is kind of further away on the bottom left-hand side corner. So hopefully events like these will help us to further create some collaboration opportunities across different countries, scholars working in different contexts to help better understand these type of important issues related to governments and civil service. All right. And based on our review, we looked at then what are some of the types and types of studies that are being done in this topic. So the most popular method of approach for the experimental work has been survey experiments. So manipulating some provision of different types of texts and then trying to see what the differential effects of those may be, followed by lab experiments and field experiments. For the sake of time, let me try to move on a little faster. And for the role of PSM, we see a lot of work on the impact or the effects of PSM. Almost it's like a vast majority of the number of works that we have. Whereas the number of works that's trying to look at some kind of real outcome seems to be quite limited, as well as the number of work that tries to leverage an experimental approach to provide better measurement seems to be quite limited as well. Some takeaways that we had from looking at these reviews, conducting this review, was that first, we kind of need to think about having bigger sample size, more diverse population, and more diverse study sites as well. So a lot of especially the earlier works, we're looking at sort of a smaller sample size, ranging all the way from 16 to with a median of 250 in the N. So, given that the kind of things that we want to do oftentimes will involve a number of treatment arms, we kind of want to think about how we can have a larger and better representative sample size. Also, I think this is closely related with the type of population that we're using in our sample. So a lot of the studies are using students, college students, and master's students, and that kind of limits the number of people that you can approach. Of course, there are cost issues and so on, and that is understandable, but a lot of our understandings that we're drawing from about PSM seems to be coming from very limited types of population. Students, some public employees, general population, and only one study we could find on the public service applicants, which is a little bit related to the research design that we want to present in a little bit. And also, the sample countries are heavily concentrated to the regions where the scholars are coming from, obviously. So there's a lot of studies in the US and Europe, and only a few in the non-Western Europe or the US context, and maybe one or two in developing country context as well. So probably we want to replicate some of the studies in different contexts to better understand how the validity of the experiments that has been conducted or the expectations that we have derived can travel to different contexts as well. And also, there are a few more points that I wanted to briefly raise, is that although measurement of PSM is very difficult, again, because of the potential social desirability bias, only a few works that we have examined actually take this issue very seriously and tends to measure the PSM with just straight up survey questions, which will be very likely to be subject to biases. And thinking about ways to tackle these, employing some experimental methodologies that are widely available in other contexts may be an important consideration. Experimental manipulation of the treatment is the key to experiment research. This may sound very obvious to many of you, but one of the things that we noticed was many of these studies that claimed to be experimental did not necessarily experimentally manipulate the treatment. And sometimes it was very hard to understand where exactly the experiment was happening in some of the papers that were already published in very good places. So because of that, we wanted to just emphasize that if you're conducting an experimental study, the treatment needs to be the key and very clearly presented. And that's probably also related to our third point, in that we need to try to think about the order in which the treatment happens. This was especially a prone issue for survey experiments, where oftentimes you had a study where your outcome variable was actually measured before the treatment took place. And that may sound very surprising to some of you, but that was also one of the more common issues that we could find. And one of the things that we wanted to emphasize in the paper that we're working on right now is that we really want to think about avoiding conditioning on the post-treatment variables and thinking about the right place or the impacted treatment placement on the different variables that you're trying to capture. So based on these background research that we have done, then we kind of moved on to thinking about, okay, if the current state of the work on experimental research, especially into PSM, is as such, what are some of the things, especially given the Korean context, what are some of the interesting ideas or interesting expectations that we can try to test better? And we have developed this multi-phased experimental research plan, which I'll be explaining in a brief moment, that hopefully leverages some of the unique characteristics of the Korean context, as well as in doing so, they'll still be able to draw some implications for other contexts as well. So what am I talking about? So the motivation here for us, the starting point was whether the competitive exam process hinders selecting the right candidates into public service. As well as, once selected, how do we cultivate better qualities? So, in other words, if what we want is high PSM individuals in the civil service, the kind of exam or the selection procedure that we have currently, is it doing its work properly? And secondly, once we employ these people into the civil service, how do we make them even sort of higher on the PSM dimension? So meritocratic selection of candidates seems to be important, and Korea, in fact, has been cited a lot as a very good example of having a very clearly laid out civil service exam, meritocratic abilities, and so on and so forth. But we also are in a situation where there may be too much competition. Right? Becoming a civil servant is a very highly valued occupation, and it seems like the level of competition coupled with the relatively high rewards in terms of salaries, in terms of security, in terms of welfare, these two things combined, maybe we are in a situation where the highly public service minded people are actually being deterred from or discouraged from pursuing civil service jobs. So we wanted to test this particular expectation in the Korean context. So the goal here in a broader sense is comparing the effectiveness of management instruments adopted in selecting and hiring civil servants. And as our initial case study, we are preparing and almost about to launch two different the same experiment in two different country contexts of Korea and Taiwan, and also have plans to extend this, and that is an older version of my slide, extend this to other different heterogeneous contexts as well, including Vietnam, India, and other countries in the Asian region. We plan for 4 waves of data collection, first starting with the so here the decision is decision to take the civil service exam. So pre-decision and exam preparation period. And then secondly, after taking the exam, before the results are announced. And third, once you are selected, before getting assigned, when you are in the civil service training, after being selected by the state. And then finally, trying to replicate the first 3 stages out to the different country and cultural contexts. And the remaining maybe 5 minutes or so, I will focus on just going through the first stage of the plan that we have. So as said before, the main question we have is, can highly competitive exams select high type or high PSM type candidates? And we have some observational studies that actually shows that it actually fails to do so. It actually gets you to end up with low PSM types, most of all. So, but there are challenges here because the studies are not necessarily conducted with the population of potential exam registrants. If we want to look at whether high PSM people actually take the exam or not, we want to look at people who are not yet civil servants, right? So we want to look at people who will potentially register for the exam. And there can be also indigeneity concerns without going into too much details. And the other part that we're interested in is also about sort of recruitment messages as well. And Professor Don Lee in the audience is working with us to further develop this idea as an affiliate to our lab. And the idea here is that there are existing studies out there looking at how different recruitment messages can also have differential effects on what type of people are willing to take the exam in the first place. And we want to sort of leverage some of those findings in our context and try to test out the expectations. So in the first stage, in the recruitment stage, what we want to do is we want to look at a kind of reverse sample of recruitments from online ads and place them on civil service preparation related websites, targeted ads on social network services, and try to reach out to the population of potential exam registrants. And at this stage, the treatment will be sort of, for those of you who have seen the Ashraf paper and AER 220, the treatment will be mostly related to emphasizing different values that may be relevant for why people are motivated to join the civil service. And the intent here will be related to how we can look at different rates of then the sort of pseudo recruitment, people who click onto the ads, people who are taking surveys that will follow, as well as some behavioral measures at the end. And then once you get recruited into taking the survey, then what we'll provide is differential message about the level of competition or level of difficulty in passing the exam. So just as an example of one of our treatment arms, for example, and let me read, for your information, less than 1 out of 40 applicants passed, made it through the final stages of the civil service exam in Korea. Suppose that the Korean government aims to increase the passing rate higher, then would this influence your decision to take the exam? And then so the bold letter part will be the part where we'll be replacing the different cues about the characteristics of the exam and trying to see if that can make a difference in the kind of self-reported as well as a behavioral measure of your willingness to take the civil service exam. So the intent here is obviously thinking about the difference in the service The first test was, that we intend to do is about looking at the difference in the service taker characteristics, and then also looking at whether that relates to different types, different levels of your willingness to take the exam. All right, I think I have about a couple minutes, so let me try to wrap up. And then from here, so up to the first phase is what we have in design so far. And for phase 2 and ongoing, we are sort of in the planning stage. So just to highlight a few, after you pass the written exam, then we want to see if the non-written part, so the interviews and the long kind of a in-house training part, can actually try to select better the high PSM type compared to the written exam. And then in the pre-assignment part, when all the selected candidates are brought together for the formal training before you get assigned to your job posts, we want to see if the different management methods or different training methods that are actually employed by the Civil Service Training Agency, whether the different types of approaches have a different impact on cultivating higher or lower PSM. And as mentioned before, we then want to extend this to other country contexts as well, where there may be similarly high levels of value placed in civil service, very similar cultural backgrounds, but differential levels of meritocracy or impartiality in the civil service. And with that, I guess my time's almost or already up, so I'll stop there. And we have a few other plans in the process, but would love to hear any feedback or advices about our design or the plans as we go forward, as well as thinking about any sort of collaboration efforts, especially in different contexts and different countries. All right, thank you very much.